Hi, I'm Mark. This is Reasons to Read It. This is where I talk about what I think are good reasons to read non-fiction books. And here I'm going to give 5 reasons to read this book, John Gray's Straw Dogs. It was first published just over 20 years ago in 2002. I read it for the first time this year in 2023. And firstly, I'm just going to quickly list these 5 reasons, and then I will go through each one in more detail after that. So, very briefly, the 5 reasons are: number 1, this is a very accessible entry point into the realm of reading philosophy. Philosophy can obviously be very impenetrable and obscure realm of thought. This is a good way to start getting into that. Secondly, the book has some very interesting things to say on the debate between religion and atheism. Obviously, that debate has had a massive impact on popular intellectual life, certainly in the USA and the UK in the last 10, 15 years, with things like, the 4 horsemen of new atheism, and then more recently, people like Jordan Peterson and Ben Shapiro having a pretty massive cultural impact defending Christianity and Judaism. Third reason is that the book also has a lot to say on the relationship between mankind and the natural environment, which is in an era where, this year, Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, has said, we have entered the era of global boiling, and this sense of looming crisis is getting more and more intense every year. This book has a lot to say about how we can rethink that issue. Fourth reason to read it is that the book is very critical of a lot of dominant modes of thought, but it does present and defend a particular philosophical outlook, and does propose an intellectual framework to consider. And then the 5th reason is that written right at the start of this 21st century, this book does offer a series of predictions. It's interesting to look at those now that we're 1/5 of the way through the century since the book was written. Okay, let's have a look at the reasons one by one. Okay, reason number 1, that this is a pretty accessible entry point to reading philosophy. I certainly consider that to be the case. Will Self is quoted on the cover of the book saying, this is a wholly accessible text, which I think is a fair enough claim, especially when you compare this book to the history of, the greats of European philosophy, which can be incredibly difficult to read, incredibly impenetrable. This is not that. It is, first of all, the way it's structured it's deliberately structured in a way to make it readable. The book is divided into very short subdivisions of each chapter, sometimes as short as just a few lines long, never longer than a few pages long. This is obviously with a view to it being accessible to the reader and fairly easy to get through. The book is only, I think, 200 odd pages long. You can read it within a few hours. There is a kind of debate over whether you would count this as a work of pure philosophy or not. From the Anglo-American analytic tradition point of view, you wouldn't count it as pure philosophy, because from that point of view, philosophy needs to be a purely abstract mental exercise that does not engage with or take into account what is going on in terms of social and political reality, and so shouldn't really engage with literature or scientific claims of the day or things like that. Those are things that the text does do. It takes examples from things like Joseph Conrad's text, Lord Jim. It's got a really interesting example of a moral dilemma and how the main character reacts to that in the text, Lord Jim. You wouldn't do this in analytic philosophy. So from that point of view, you can ask yourself whether this is actually philosophy or not. However, from the tradition of continental philosophy, this absolutely is philosophy, and it totally is fine to engage with things like science and literature whilst you're carrying out philosophy. In any case, the second chapter of the book is very directly and explicitly about the history of Western thought, and it goes through things like Kant, Schopenhauer, Hume, Nietzsche, Heidegger, obviously I've made a list here, you can tell I'm reading it out, Wittgenstein, and also postmodernism. And it has very short sections on each of these. So then, though that chapter in itself is a fairly useful way of starting to think about what those thinkers have written about. That whole chapter is called The Deception, and he's got a very negative view of Western philosophy as a whole. He says on page 37, philosophy is the attempt to find good reasons for conventional beliefs. In other words, philosophy is not generally carried out in good faith. It is not an objective and fair-minded way to analyse what we ought to believe to arrive at the fairest, most objective conclusions. Instead, it's just a way of justifying what is already thought and believed prior to the exercise of carrying out the philosophy. This is reminiscent of a philosopher, he doesn't actually mention at all in the text, Gilles Deleuze, 20th century French philosopher, who describes philosophy as an image of thought that precisely prevents people from thinking. And I think there Deleuze is kind of talking about the fact that the impenetrability and obscurity of philosophical texts effectively makes philosophy into something of a gated community that most people are shut out from, and therefore it's actually served to prevent people from thinking. It's also reminiscent of Nietzsche, who actually is someone he does talk about a lot in the book. Nietzsche talks about, he's got this section in his book Beyond Good and Evil called On the Prejudices of the Philosophers, and it's exactly the same claim actually, that philosophy is not really ever carried out in good faith, and it's just philosophers are just rationalizing and justifying their own prejudices through what seem to be highly objective and rigorous systems of thought, but actually are not. The main claim, I think there's one central claim he's got about the history of philosophy, which is that he rejects the idea that runs through a lot of Western philosophy, that the world is a mirror of human thought. In other words, that human thought and human consciousness has this absolutely primary position in reality, and that the world is sort of constructed through human consciousness, and that taken in extremes, that would mean that without human consciousness, there actually isn't a world. And we'll come back to that claim a little bit later on. Another way to put this point is that there's this theme running throughout the book that of anti-humanism, anti-human centrism, against the idea that humanity actually is the centre of reality. That's an absolutely central theme to the book, and I'll come back to that later on. Okay, whilst a lot of the energy of this book is kind of aimed at taking down systems of thought and attacking dominant modes of thinking, it does actually put forward some positive philosophical perspectives. Most of the people he mentions in the book he's attacking, but he does have some praise for people like, I think he's pretty positive about Schopenhauer, James Lovelock, and a couple of others. But there are positive elements in the book, and there is a positive perspective put forward, which we will come back to in reason 4 a bit later on. All right, reason number 2, the contribution this book makes to the debate between atheism on the one hand and Christian monotheistic belief on the other. So this debate, of course, is often presented as a binary choice between whether you either believe that God does exist or does not, notwithstanding the agnostic position of uncertainty, but essentially it's presented as two completely opposing positions. People like, the neo atheists certainly present it that way. As it's a kind of adversarial rejection of Christian belief and Islamic and Jewish belief also in a monotheistic God. As I mentioned in the intro, we've had some major cultural influences defending monotheistic belief a little more recently in Jordan Peterson, Ben Shapiro, people like this. But again, I would say there's still this kind of presentation of the issue as a binary one between either accepting or rejecting God's existence. But John Gray employs a certain maneuver in the book where he does not see this as a binary choice, basically. So let me explain a little with a couple of quotes. So On page 31, he says, humanism is a secular myth thrown together from the decaying scraps of Christian myth. On page 127, he says, atheism is a late bloom for a Christian passion for truth. So you can see here he's overtly describing atheism as actually a form of Christianity. He doesn't acknowledge this in the book, but John Gray's completely borrowing this idea from Nietzsche, who wrote about exactly the same idea in the 1880s. For example, in Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil, published in 1886, section 55, he talks about what he describes as the ladder of religious cruelty, where he describes the final stage of Christian belief, having gone through these stages of different types of sacrifice, that the end point is the sacrifice of God himself. Okay, so in other words, so the rejection of God's, the assertion that God does not exist is actually simply an extension of Christian ideology. So this is worth unpacking a bit, because that might not seem like it makes much sense on face value. But let's go back to this idea that atheism is a late bloom for a Christian passion for truth. So here is very, very clearly echoing Nietzsche, who talks about the will to truth. He uses this phrase a lot, and Nietzsche questions and criticizes this idea that that the truth is something we must desire above all else. One way of thinking about this is there's a really interesting debate between Mehdi Hassan and Richard Dawkins, probably at least 10 years old now. I think it was perhaps at the Oxford Union. And there's one striking moment in it where, Dawkins is saying, well, I'm just interested in the truth. I don't care what the benefits are of your beliefs are. To me, the only thing which matters is the truth. And that might seem self-evident on the face of it. But Nietzsche asked this question, his exact wording actually is, what is it in us that desires the truth? So he actually asks, okay, why do we have to value the truth above all else? And John Gray's got a couple of good examples where he says, actually, by always pursuing the truth and saying the truth must be pursued at all costs, we are actually sacrificing some other things. He does this through comparing Christianity to paganism. A couple of quotes again. Page 126, Christianity struck at the root of pagan tolerance of illusion. In claiming there is only one true faith, it gave truth a supreme value it had not had before. So this pagan idea, you can actually choose illusion, you can use illusion, is a way for human beings to live if they want to. And actually it's a choice to say, well, no, truth's more important than that. The next page, 127, no pagan is willing to sacrifice the pleasure of life for the sake of mere truth. Well, that reminds me again of this Dawkins point, that Dawkins's claim is that, whatever the cost, we must be beholden to the truth. Pagans, John Gray, Nietzsche would all actually raise that as a question. Why do we have to pursue the truth at all costs? Could there be times where we actually choose, as Nietzsche put it, why not rather untruth? What else did I want to say about this? Only with Christianity did the belief take root that one way of life could be lived by everyone. That's on page 125, spinning onto 126 of Straw Dogs. So this idea that actually there is just one way that the whole of humanity should live. John Gray makes the very insightful observation that that's a new idea of Christianity. There was no need for human beings prior to that to think that whatever they believed, that their own perspective needed to be shared by the whole of humanity. And actually it's a new Christian idea that it's not only possible, but it's desirable that one ideology, one religious belief should be shared by the whole of humanity. So, there you go. There's a second reason to read the book. So, albeit an idea borrowed from Nietzsche, it is a way of recasting this debate, which goes beyond and is not compatible, I don't think, with either the new atheists, nor with the sort of defense of more conventional Judeo-Christian thought from Peterson, Shapiro, etc. Okay, reason number 3 to read John Gray's Straw Dogs is the recasting of humanity's relationship to the natural environment that he proposes. So, this book's 20 years old, but of course, the global community was well aware of the possibility of climate change at that point. But having said that, we're living in increasingly grim, concerning and worrying times on that front. So the book does offer a kind of new way of thinking about this, but which in some ways is reassuring, but only in a very kind of limited sense. And it certainly doesn't offer us any kind of silver bullet for escaping the kind of feeling of existential dread that we can be forgiven for experiencing when we hear some of the projections for what could happen in terms of the climate this century. Okay, there's a very simple sentence on page 12 which introduces his way of reconceptualizing the relationship between mankind and nature, and it is simply the claim that on page 12 humanity does not exist. Now, what does he mean by this? Obviously, he doesn't mean that human beings are in some way not real. In fact, I think that sentence continues by saying humanity doesn't exist. All there are a variety of human beings. So to explain this, what he means by this is he's trying to dispel an illusion that has dominated Western thought. And he traces this back to the thought of Plato and the origins of Christianity. On page 137, he says, Platonism and Christianity have always claimed that humans do not belong in the natural world. In other words, that they are superior to it. They are above it. For Plato, that meant that human beings should try to escape the world of appearances and temporary phenomena that we experience every day and try to escape into this realm of pure thought, the world of forms. And for Christianity, of course, that means that there's a higher realm beyond this life that awaits us, which is kind of where humanity truly belongs. And so both of these perspectives, which, again, like Nietzsche, John Gray associates Platonism and Christianity together, both of these perspectives, kind of position mankind as, okay, we're in the natural world, but we're actually above it, and we're superior to it in many ways. And he says that the modernity reinforces this. A major theme of the book is that progress is really quite illusory. And he talks about how the advance of knowledge fools us into thinking that we are not animals on page 155. In other words, that the advance of knowledge makes us feel that as Platonism and Christianity tell us, we are above the natural world. But a major claim of the book is that is not at all true. We, in fact, absolutely are part of the natural world. And the title of the book and many of the arguments throughout it claim that actually we need to emphasize that we are animals and we are part of the natural realm much more than we like to think we are. So here's a good way on page 58 of trying to understand what he's getting at. He says, if humanists are to be believed, the earth with its vast wealth of ecosystems and life forms had no value until humans came on the scene. So that's a very direct, clear critique of this idea of putting human consciousness as somehow at the center of reality and as being somehow above and separate from the rest of the natural world. So what does this mean, and what is he trying to imply for recasting the debate or the question of what is mankind's relationship to the natural environment? Page 59, consciousness counts for far less than we have been taught. Again, trying to de-center humanity and in particular human consciousness in our overall picture of reality. And he says, again, being very critical of Platonism and Christianity and its effect on our thought, he points to the fact that it's actually a relatively new thing in human history that we have this arrogance and this overinflated sense of our position in reality. Page 17, he says, for much of their history, humans did not see themselves as being any different from the other animals among which they lived, even seeing animals as in some ways superior to them. So that's an interesting thought, and I think it's hard to deny when you are confronted with it that we do in in modernity and in secular life and in advanced late capitalism. It's hard to not see ourselves as separate from and above the rest of nature. So it's posing a very interesting question that actually are we not perhaps fooling ourselves in that regard, and actually should we not be seeing ourselves as simply one other phenomenon within the range of within the natural world? There's a great quote I like a lot on page 16. There's another one on 171 which is similar. Page 16, he says the internet is as natural as a spider's web. The internet is just one other thing that has been developed during the course of the history of this planet. And as complex and as wondrous as we might think it might be, we could say something similar about the spider's web, which also is something which appeared on the scene at a certain moment in natural history, almost like a technology in itself. He says something similar on page 171. Conservationists lament the passing of wild places, but cities too are endangered ecosystems. Again, this idea that that actually the products of human endeavour, whether they are technological or cities, etc., are actually just another stage in the natural history of the planet and are not what we normally think them to be, which is somehow separate from and above the rest of nature. How does this help us rethink the climate crisis? Well, essentially, it is decentering the importance of human consciousness, and he talks about how the survival of the planet is assured with or without humanity, and that the loss of humanity is not necessarily something to lament as much as we might normally think. So you can see what I meant when I said earlier that this is perhaps not a massively reassuring way out of the existential angst of climate crisis, but it's nonetheless well worth engaging with this idea that perhaps we are much more part of the natural environment than we like to think. Okay, reason 4 to read John Gray's Straw Dogs is the fact that it does actually put forward a positive intellectual framework and worldview. And as I've said, he spends a lot of time criticising secular humanism and Christianity. And on page 31 and 32, he talks about what's the contrasting ideology that he kind of praises in place of those. He says that what he refers to as Gaia theory is an antidote to secularism, humanism, and Christianity. So he says on 32, the theory, he describes what he understands by Gaia theory, which is a term he borrows from James Lovelock. And he describes Gaia theory as the theory that the Earth is a self-regulating system whose behaviour resembles in some ways that of an organism. And he also claims that might sound like a bit of a kind of mystical New Age kind of claim that the Earth is alive and is an organism in the same way that human beings or animals are. But he claims that actually this, in his words, embodies the most rigorous scientific naturalism. In other words, he thinks that this theory that the Earth is a living organism is coherent and defensible from a scientific point of view. This is obviously a very central claim in the book, because actually the title of the entire book, Straw Dogs, comes from a line which he quotes from the Tao Te Ching, which he claims is an early source of Gaia theory, although the term Gaia theory is not actually coined until the 20th century. So he quotes this line from the Tao Te Ching on page 34. Heaven and earth are ruthless and treat the myriad creatures as straw dogs. Obviously, that's the title of the book. That's the line where he gets the title from. So what does he mean by that, and how does it relate to the idea of Gaia theory? Basically, that line of describing heaven and earth as ruthless and domineering over humanity as well as all other living creatures is embodying this idea that the natural world is alive and actually in some ways is superior to us. And that of course, ties into what I was talking about previously with his recasting of how we look at the natural environment, and that actually it's only through an excessive privileging of the importance of human life that we enter into the existential anxiety that the climate crisis provokes in us. So in line with this, I've talked earlier in this video about how he has some positive things to say about paganism. And he also, as I said before, the book is for the most part a criticism and a demolition of current dominant modes of thought. But he does have a section called In Praise of Polytheism. Section 3 of chapter 4 has that title. And here he talks about how this is also part of his explanation of the philosophy or worldview that he is trying to advance. He says that polytheism, unlike monotheism, saw religious belief as a matter. Well, actually, belief is the wrong term here, because his point about polytheism is that it sees religion as a matter of practice. Religion is something you embody and live every day. It is not a matter of belief or abstraction, which is what he criticizes Christianity for. Christianity portrays religion as something which is just a matter of belief, in many ways an intellectual exercise, a mental exercise, not rather than one that is lived in everyday life. Now, that's reminiscent of a lot of recent thought in religious studies. For example, there's a book called Graham Harvey's book called Food, Sex and Strangers: Understanding Religion as Everyday Life, which makes exactly the same point, that it is actually specific to Christianity that's casting religion as something which is part of mental life, rather than an embodied part of lived life. And so there's this recent movement in religious studies called, deriving from the study of folk religion, more recently called vernacular religion, this idea that religion, we need to get away from the kind of Western Judeo-Christian view of religion as something that's is a mental exercise, and see it as something that is practiced through everyday life instead. And this goes back to his idea, the idea I mentioned earlier, of seeing consciousness, human consciousness, as actually counting for far less than we suppose it to. I'm just going to close off this section by reading one very short section of the text, because it's a great statement of what he actually proposes as a kind of antidote to not only secular humanism but also Christianity. And this is in section 16 of chapter 4. It ends off that chapter. So he starts off with a criticism of existing dominant philosophies. He says, nearly all philosophies, most religions and much of science testify to a desperate and unwearying concern with the salvation of mankind. So he's criticizing it for this focus on the only thing that really counts is human consciousness and positioning humanity at the center of reality. He says, however, if we turn from solipsism, we will be less concerned with the fate of the human animal. Health and sanity do not lie in an introverted love of human things, but in turning to what Robinson Jeffers in his poem Meditation on Saviours calls the coast opposite humanity. In other words, it's all about decentering humanity and human consciousness as the focal point of reality itself. I don't think I mentioned this, but earlier in the text he coins this term Homo sapiens, and by that he means he talks about how the destructive nature of the human animal is just completely fundamental and integral to humanity, and it always has been, always will be. He says human sapiens is only one of very many species and not obviously worth preserving. Again, returns to this idea that actually perhaps we should not be as concerned as we are, that the preservation of humanity is the only thing, is the fundamental, should be the fundamental concern. He says later or sooner it will become extinct. When it is gone, the earth will recover. Long after the last traces of the human animal have disappeared, many of the species it is bent on destroying will still be around, along with the others that have yet to spring up. The earth will forget mankind, the play of life will go on. So, of course, that in some ways is a despairing model, but he's positioning it as a positive philosophy, which is one way to I suppose cope with the possible crises that face humanity. The final reason to read it that I'm going to give you is the fact that John Gray offers a series of predictions in the final chapter of the book for the 21st century. And as I say, in a way, there's more interesting to read that now that 20 years have actually elapsed since it was first published. So as I've said in the fourth reason, the third, and touched on it in the fourth reason, he has a lot to say about man's relationship with the natural environment. And he does talk about his predictions for humanity's ability to deal with the climate crisis in the 21st century. On page 184, he says that what he calls a green utopia is technologically possible. We can achieve it in terms of the technology we have, but more pessimistically, he says it's not humanly possible. And quoting Bertrand Russell a couple of pages before, he takes a very pessimistic view of human nature, arguing we love destruction too much. We cannot overcome our inherent desire for destruction, even though we have it within our grasp technologically to kind of save ourselves. He also has some predictions to make about ordinary and working life. These are particularly interesting because I think you can certainly see some steps towards his predictions since 2002. He talks about how, obviously in the 19th century we had the Industrial Revolution. Industrialization became the norm for human ordinary working life. And he says on page 162 that the days of industry are nearly over, and that the days are coming where nearly almost all humans work to amuse other human beings, which reminds me of the film, Spike Jonze film Her, with Joaquin Phoenix, which is very much about the same idea. I think that technology has advanced to such a point where human labour is kind of pushed into the terrain where the small areas of working life that AI can't actually achieve. For example, the main character in that film, his job is writing blurbs for greetings cards, which reminds me of this idea that the economy is moving more and more towards humans will just work to distract each other. And John Gray himself talks about the J.G. Ballard novel Cocaine Nights, where humanity moves into a more and more asinine version of existence, more and more dominated by leisure, but in so doing, becoming more and more detached from meaning. And so obviously that's quite a pessimistic outlook. He also talks about this idea of, I think again from another J.G. Ballard novel, he mentions this idea that people will seek meaning through getting controlled micro doses of violence to get us back in touch with a sort of more visceral, meaningful sense of what it means to be alive. And I mean, the book actually, I suppose, would have come out just a little bit after Fight Club, but of course that idea is very reminiscent of that film as well. And then finally, he talks about artificial intelligence. Again, he's talking about this in 2002. We've just seen, I would say, in the last 12 months, a big step change in how the public discourse on AI has changed with the advent of ChatGPT, which has provoked a huge amount of public conversation and anxiety. He says back in 2002 that AI may well overrun us, which of course has become an idea that is very much part of the pervading discourse now. And he says that the new virtual environment is no more controllable than the natural worlds, embodying, of course, a lot of the fears and things that are being said about AI nowadays. He also says AI will be spiritual and have its own new natural languages, which, so again, he's kind of having proposed the natural world as something that, despite kind of appearances, is actually in some ways above us and out beyond our control, not something humanity should be hoping to control. He's also proposing that AI is going to be another frontier that confronts us beyond our control, which is another way of reinforcing this idea of humanity as straw dogs that get blown around in the wind and destroyed at the whim of something that is beyond our control. Okay, all right, so that was the fifth reason you might want to read this book. Okay, that's 5 reasons to read John Gray's Straw Dogs. There's plenty of other things going on in the book that I've not really touched on. Just to very quickly list a couple of other things, there's a lot to say about how morality works, the history of morality. He has a lot to say about the idea of universalism, of modernism, what modernity means, of free will and determinism. He dives into neuroscience and things like that. So there's plenty of other things going on in the book. But those are my 5 reasons that I hope might encourage you to read the book for yourselves. This is my first video in what I'm planning to make a series. If you'd like to drop any comments below, I would really like to respond to those and engage with you on what you think of this book. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.